Hello, people of the internet. Steve Persh here of Pantheon. One of the ways I myself came to Pantheon was through the in person ecosystem of Drupal camps and conferences. One of the reasons I liked then and still really enjoy going to in person events is because they're a chance to learn new ideas, reconnect with old friends and colleagues, and often catch up on areas that myself or any given person may not be deeply immersed in. One of those areas for me over the years has been the nuts and bolts of front end development. For much of my career as a web professional, I'll say, I have been intrigued by the idea that there are conceptual components of front end development. People often use Lego metaphors here, but making that metaphor true, operationalizing it, can be sticky, can be messy. And so I've often treated going to Drupal camps and Drupal cons as a chance to reconnect to people who are closer to the work than I am and find out, okay, right now in this year, what is the way that people are actually doing that concept? How are people actually going from the idea of components to the reality for real live websites? And one of the people that I've enjoyed catching up with over the years, Chaz Chumley, and we've got his colleague Mario Hernandez as well. You guys have been excellent resources in the Drupal community, both for those informal sorts of check-ins, but also formal presentations and trainings. But I may be doing too much here. I'll give you guys just a moment to introduce yourselves. Chaz, for those who haven't met you at a DrupalCon or a Drupal camp, can you tell us about your work?
Definitely. Thanks, Steve. So Chaz Chumley, been doing Drupal now since probably, 2007. If you were at DrupalCon and Dries says, stay standing up. If you've been doing for Drupal for quite a while, I was standing up for quite a while. Uh, but during my journey of being a Drupalist, I had a mentor a long time ago said, get the stuff out of my head and get it back into other people's head. And so that's what I've been doing all along, whether it's been a back end technical architect, a front end architect, a manager, filling different roles. The front end has really been my passion. And so I've written books on Drupal. I've done videos for lynda.com. I've taught at camps, cons, you name it. And front end component based development and design has been one of those where it started with Pattern Lab. Now everybody, the hot word is Storybook. And so we're hoping today to be able to get some of that information out of me and Mario's heads and out into the World Wide Web.
And Mario, how about you? How did you find yourself intrigued or deep in the world of component-based design and implementation?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Strangely enough, I actually started Drupal with Drupal also back in around 2007, just like Chaz. And I just fell in love with Drupal. And mostly I started with front end because I was the only developer to do that. And so people were very unique, very specific about what they wanted things to look like, regardless of how it was built in the back end. And so, but then I started attending camps and cons, and my passion continued to grow, especially in front end. And as I saw different people conducting this training presentations or training workshops, I really, not to put anybody down, but I said, well, if they can do it, I can do it. So I started doing small things, the simplest thing, CSS kind of trainings and kind of things like that. Then I started to grow into more advanced topics. When responsive web design came out back in 2010, then I really just I was like a sponge trying to learn all of it about it. So I started training about that, and then component web development then just took over, and that's when really my training uh, chops came out all the way. I was working for Media Current as the head of training there, so I would conduct training for their clients, for our own team, and for the community as well. Chaz and I have done both training together on component development, DrupalCons and Drupal camps. And I continue to actually share the knowledge, not as training anymore. I don't do that as much ever since COVID, but What I do is I continue to write about all the things that I'm working on or learning about. And so on my personal website, you can find all the latest stuff that I'm working on, including the topic that we're going to be covering today. So really excited to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to learn more. I feel like I should call out there's a commonality here of the year 2007,
Yeah,
also the year
yeah,
I started using Drupal.
it is
Probably
something.
not a coincidence.
Yep.
That was the year of Drupal 5 plus CCK plus
I
views,
started with six.
and that
So yeah,
okay, yeah, that was a very powerful, combination
yeah.
of the core platform, and those modules, were rocket fuel for many people in that era. So, we've got, your slides pulled up here. Mario, tell us more.
Yeah. So I joined the UCLA team where Chaz was already working on. It's gonna be a year, Chaz. By the way, next month it's gonna be a year. So start getting me
Sounds
a present or something ready, okay? But yes, since Chaz have known for a long time, he told me about this opportunity. So I joined the team, and he had just completed rebuilding pretty much the entire gallery of the components that UCLA Health uses for their hundreds of websites. And at the time, he was using PatternLab, and which is the platform that I've been using for many years as well. But even during the interview process, he mentioned that his goal was to move those components to Storybook and basically build a whole new front end system for the platform. And so a few months after I joined the team, we started looking into what it will take to make that happen. That migration from Pattern Lab to Storybook, completely different platforms, right? Pattern Lab is, is node based, where Storybook is JavaScript based. So huge differences in the platform, the infrastructure. So our main concern is, okay, we want to make sure that we move these components to Storybook, but with little to no refactoring. And so that's kind of how our um, you know process began. But before we get too detailed into what it took to make this happen, I'm going to kind of break things down into the areas that we're going to be talking about here, both Chas and I. And first we started, what is the requirements that we want to make sure that are fulfilled during this migration. What will be our evaluation process, because there's a lot of tools out there. How do we know what's the best tool to select for our new project? The implementation process, how is that going to play along with our typical release schedule, and the testing that needs to happen from content editors to developers and everything else. And then the actual migration of components. As I said before, we wanted to be able to move those components to a new platform, but we didn't have to rebuild those components because Chaz had just completed that process. And then what would that mean to Drupal integration now that the components live somewhere else? So then we'll go into a quick demo and kind of show you the actual nuts and bolts of how that was done. But as far as the requirements, um, I think from the beginning we kind of knew that we wanted a storybook. And because I remember Chaz mentioned that, do you have an experience of move from Pattern to Storybook? And I said, no, but it sounds like a lot of fun, and it was definitely a learning experience for both of us. So we already knew that we wanted Storybook just because within the Drupal ecosystem, Storybook is getting a lot of attraction. There's a lot of modules now tailored for Storybook, and so it's getting a lot of traction. And so it seems like the natural choice for us to go to Storybook. We wanted definitely a system that was well maintained and supported, and the Storybook is definitely that. In fact, we Chaz and I joke around that we just cannot keep up with the releases of Storybook, and it's true. I think right now we're about 6 or 7 releases behind, and we just updated like a couple weeks ago, and so they're really active, and we're very pleased about that. No component refactoring, as I mentioned before, that was probably the key requirement for us. Is we didn't have to redo everything that had just been done recently. Something that was relatively easy to maintain, something that we were familiar with. Although Storybook is JavaScript based, which is completely different than Pattern Nav, we wanted something that was relatively easy to maintain, that was a lot of support and resources available for in case we run into issues. Obviously, we want a living style guide as the single source of truth. We want to make sure that any front end work was done on this living style guide, and Drupal will simply consume the work that we've done on the front end. So our evaluation process.
Mario, could I interrupt you just for a minute
Sure.
and ask some clarifying questions on that previous slide? So you've got the phrase "living style guide" here, which I want to unpack just a little bit because I've been at Pantheon for a decade now. Before that, I was in the agency world, and the phrase "living style guide" was
Right.
coming into fashion.
Yep.
Uh, 2012, 2013, 2014. And I started to get skeptical of it because I saw in at least some of the projects I was either working on or observing from the side, I could see these style guides are not staying alive. They are zombie style guides. The situation was you mentioned earlier responsive design.
Hmm.
That was a huge shift in how websites had to be designed. To call a design done and be credible, you had to think through, like, how is it gonna squish?
Right.
And before that, like, you could credibly say, "I've designed a website," and what you meant was, like, I made the Photoshop
Right.
or InDesign comps, and, like, that's a picture of what the website is going to look like. Now, with release of the iPhone, the iPad, like, you need to at least show how it squishes. You may not need to dictate every detail, but you gotta show how it squishes. So, okay, people start figuring out the CSS and the markup outside of Drupal or WordPress or whatever the final website might be. They're calling it a living style guide, but at least in my experience, many of the early projects that tried that had a zombie state where, like, okay, the CSS and the HTML was figured out somewhere else. It was low friction, but then at some point, it all got copy pasted over to Drupal or WordPress or
Right.
whatever, and that became where the real thing was, and there was no ongoing connection. So I think much of what you're going to show us is like, how does the ongoing connection live? How does the digital blood flow between these systems to keep it alive, so you're not stuck with a zombie style guide that is like, "Oh, yeah, that's what it was designed to look like a year and a half ago, and it's different now, but good luck figuring out how it's
Yeah.
different." Yes, I see perhaps a knowing smile there. Was that some of your experience
Oh, absolutely.
in
Yeah. Especially in
reaching
the
for the idea
beginning.
of living style?
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially at the beginning when style guides became a thing. I mean, it was extremely difficult because developers were used to the top to bottom type of design of the website on the browser, right? So, and you would do that within Drupal
Mhm,
and all of that, and then having to extract the front end pieces and put them somewhere else. And yet, Drupal still needed to be able to consume that resources from the from outside of it. That was challenging. However, and I'll also let Chaz speak to this. We make a great effort to ensure that what's on our style guide is what Drupal is rendering. Every single piece that our site is showing on the browser is coming directly from the style guide. And so I tell people the worst thing you want is for you to not trust your style guide, right? Because you want
mhm,
to make sure that whatever you are changes you're making to your style guide, you want to make sure that Drupal will reflect those changes. You don't want to have a difference between what's in Drupal and what's in your style guide. So both Chaz and I definitely put a lot of effort in making sure that that is the case for us. It's not 100% perfect, but I feel like
mhm.
we're getting there. And so far, is with this migration of Storybook is enforcing us more to make sure that that living relationship between Drupal and style guide is there and is the driving force for Drupal, our Storybook system, right? Chaz, anything you want to add to that?
No, I was smirking when Steve was talking because gone are the days now. I personally feel like the inside out development, like you did in Drupal, then you tried to get your HTML and CSS to match what Drupal was trying to spit out, and with the
Mhm.
addition of Twig templates, you were able to kind of start connecting those together. And you mentioned earlier, like Drupal Con Austin. and I think it was a presentation we were doing at DrupalCon Austin at the time as well, or it was DrupalCon New Orleans. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. It's been a while, but me and Adam Durana did a presentation on it was actually DrupalCon New Orleans. It was the voodoo you do was what was called, and it was our concept of how you had Pattern Lab and how you had Drupal talk to Pattern Lab, but there was still that magic copy pasta that happened where in between, so you didn't have that single source. And out of that conference, the components module came out of that. John had come up and asked that question, and smart as he is, like I swear, like 30 minutes later, he had the module written. So we're like, to where Drupal Twig, .html.twig could then understand what true Symfony.twig was, and the namespace was fixed. And you'll see this a little bit later in the presentation, but that's where we were able to truly say, okay, the Living Style Guide is our single source. We make a change, we make it over in Twig and the CSS that lives over in Pattern Lab at the time, now Storybook, and Drupal will just automatically update when it sees it because it's talking to that instance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, let's see what you're all evaluating here.
Yeah, and that's a great question, by the way, because there are developers who might still struggle with that, but it's important that that single source of truth is really the key for a system like this. So our evaluation process was very extensive. In fact, we did this for a couple months, Chaz and I. We talked to a lot of people. We talked to individuals who may have some experience with Storybook, and asked them to do quick demos for us just to see how they were building things. We talked to the Emulsify team from 4Kitchens. They were extremely, extremely helpful, and we are very, very thankful to them for really letting us pick their brain, because they have so much experience with this, building the Emulsify system originally with Pattern Lab and now with Storybook. And so we were able to pick a lot of great ideas and tips from them. We also talked to a Gesso team whose Chaz has experience with. I think Chaz was part of that system at some point. That also started with Pattern Lab, and now they're Storybook. So what we wanted is we want to make sure that we had exhausted all the different possibilities on how Storybook can be implemented. We created several prototypes, proof of concepts, just to make sure that we tried all the different ways in which people were doing this. And a lot of them were really great. But there's always something that said, I'm not quite sure about that. I don't think I like this approach, or the tools that they're using is not the tool that I'm used to it. And so what Shaz and I ended up deciding is, let's build our own system using all the best ideas from all this research we've done, and that way we can build it custom for us, the way we want to do the work, the way we want to work and interact with the tools. And so that's what we ended up doing. That was our evaluation process. So we grab all the best ideas from everybody and kind of make our own. And that was how this whole thing started for us.
Real quick, Mario, and one of the key features too, and Mario will remember this, that I kept saying, is the barrier of entry needs to be low. We need to, as our team grows, if we want to bring in a junior front-end developer, I don't want them to have to learn 5 different languages. And we also say, okay, well, we'll keep the barrier of entry low, but if we're also going to have to learn something, we might as well learn tools that are more current, more supported. And then that's where we started looking at the implementation piece that Mario will go into.
Yeah, exactly. We knew that switching from Pattern Lab to Storybook was going to require us changing the build tools. Like, we've been using Gulp for years, Chad and I. But we knew that switching to Storybook was going to require us to use most likely Webpack and other tools that come along with that. But while we did this research, and we needed to learn Webpack because we've never used it before, we started looking and seeing these mentions of Vite.js. And we started looking more into it, and we figured, this looks like an awesome tool. And if we're going to learn something new, why not learn this Vite.js tool, which seems to be kind of like the future for building tools, front-end building tools. And that way we're kind of ahead of the curve there. So we actually just make that decision to to use Vite.js for all the building, all the automation that our
Mm.
environment has. Obviously, we have Storybook, Node.js. We also opted for PostCSS, which Chaz has already done when he refactored the components prior to the migration. But we moved, well, Chaz mostly moved all the SAS to PostCSS. So now we're using pretty much native CSS for all of our environments, which is, I love it. I never go back to SAS, I don't think. Um, Although we have the option to use Storybook, the HTML version of it, we opted for the React version of it because it's like the better supported version of all. Twig.js,
Mhm.
people have some reservations about Twig.js just because it's not always in sync with the Twig version that Drupal uses, Twig PHP. But for us, it has worked well. There were a couple issues that we ran into, but there's been fixes that have happened. We have plugins and extensions that we use to make sure that we close that gap, that support gap, on things that Twig.js doesn't do out of the box. But with these extensions and plugins, we're able to close those gaps. And obviously JS and Drupal. So we're using pretty much vanilla JS, vanilla CSS for our styles. We use custom properties for CSS, and those work extremely well for us. So so this became our new tool salad here. Very modern, especially when it comes to Vite and Storybook. They're both widely supported, very popular. Vite is just amazingly fast. It's so incredible. So it was a learning curve for both of us, but we were going to have to learn something new anyway, so might as well go with the latest. Obviously, we selected Vid because it has great support by the community. The ecosystem is great for plugins, and so it's a system that has a lot of support, and we've been able to address any issues that we run into while we had this put this together.
Mhm.
So anything else, Jasper?
Yeah,
I think Steve had a question.
I do have a question. Do you have a sort of systematic way of answering when a tool like Vite is stable enough for adoption? A phrase that I actually got from a Pantheon customer that I repeat over and over again is, uh, "I want state of the art, not bleeding edge or cutting edge."
Yeah, yeah.
And, with I myself am not deeply versed enough in Vite and Webpack to know if or when,
Hmm.
uh, Vite crossed from, uh, cutting edge, bleeding edge now to state of the art, but I in evaluating tools for my, uh, my regular job at Pantheon, I've been looking at, Vite and asking, "Hmm, it seems like as I evaluate options," or I'll just say Pantheon's own documentation site, "maybe I should be leaning towards stacks that involve Vite rather than Webpack." But I feel like I'm saying that too reliant on vibes and
Yeah,
not reliant enough
it's easy
on maybe reality. So I'm curious, like you guys seem to have been more systematic in your process than I have been so far. How did you know Vite is mature enough that we can jump to it, whereas like Webpack has been around longer, covers a similar problem space, but there's enough signal that yeah, we should just go to Vite.
Yeah. Um, and originally Vid was I had never heard of it, so that's even more
Mhm.
scary, right? Because you're just hearing about it, and all of a sudden you're gonna jump into. But we did go through a very rigorous, what do you call it, evaluation process. For me,
Mhm.
there are two key elements to consider in a tool. Uh, we don't just jump to the latest tool just because it came out and it's the cool thing out there. Chaz and I have been using Gulp. I would think for me it's maybe 10 years, and
Yep.
we have never switched
Mhm.
to anything else except just Gulp. Because why? Why switch to something if the tool that I'm using is doing exactly what I need? Right? That's kind of my way of
Mhm.
thinking. So throughout these 10 years, you can imagine how many other tools have come out, but we never
Mhm.
derail from Gulp just because it did what we wanted it to do. And so, but the two elements that I consider myself when evaluating a tool is what type of um, maintenance does this tool receive, right? From first of all, from the creators of the tool. You look at their Git releases, right? You get their Git logs. So how often do they make changes, updates, and fixes to this tool? The other option that I look at is what's the community support for this tool? How many people are using it? How many people are contributing to the ecosystem of this tool? Because those are two indicators that tell me, okay, this is a solid tool. It's well maintained by the creators, and the community is adopting it and endorsing it, right? So I look at that almost like what I see when I select a new Drupal module, right? Is
Yeah,
I
I
want,
Mm.
was going to
yeah,
say that. That's I think that's the easiest parallel to draw
right,
is before you go jump on a module, you may look at it and you're like, oh, that was cool. You can go look at it and 2 sites are using. You're like, oh, I'm gonna wait for more
yeah,
sites. So that's the adoption rate. And so same paradigm held true for Vite. We looked, okay, well, how many people are downloading this? How many people are using it? And when we saw that like it was getting 7 million downloads a day, it was like, wow, this is crazy. This many people
Mm.
are downloading this tool set and using it. So I think that's the easy parallel to
Mm.
draw is Drupal modules to adoption of, because there is you tomorrow is going to be another hot JavaScript tool set.
yeah.
Tomorrow is going to be another one. And so that you don't
Mm.
always want to jump in with the newest. You want to see what the adoption rate is first.
Yeah, we wanted something
Sure.
that was
And
going to be long term for us, right? Something that we implemented, and now our job is simply to maintain it. But we don't want to keep continuing to switch tools every time something else comes out, or because the tool stop being supported. So we're hoping to build something that is going to be long term for us, and just continue to update it as time goes by.
Yeah. Plus, it
I'll
was
ask, hey, how's
Storybook also had adopted it too, as it was one of the engines you could choose from if you wanted to go straight up just with Storybook and Vite. So that was another
that's a
clue.
very strong signal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah. So the component migration process, this is the part where we said, you know what, we don't want to be having to write all the code again for these components. So we drew a parallel here on what it took to move components from Pattern Lab to Storybook. And as you can see here, things just moved from one to another. We can literally copy and paste the entire folder of a component, right? For example, a card component it has its own folder. So you just drag the folder from the old theme to the new theme, and we just changed a couple of things. For example, for documenting the component itself, in Pattern Lab we use a Markdown file MD, and Storybook we use MDX. YAML is the same, the Twig template is the same, the CSS is the same. The only thing that we added new to each component is this stories.jsx file, which is the file that Storybook looks at to display your components or stories in the style guide. And all the style does is basically just consumes all the code from these other files. So Storybook is not building this; it's simply consuming the code thanks to extensions and plugins that we've used for Storybook and mainly Vite and Storybook combined. So we'll show you that shortly. But again, this was as simple as it gets. Very little refactoring of components. It was a pretty parallel one-to-one type of a move that we made here. And this was for most of the components. There were a couple of things that we still needed to tweak, but the bulk of the work that needed to be done for the migration was simply copying and pasting into the new system. Chaz, anything you'd like to add to this here?
No, I mean, I think this was, when we saw this, because that was one of our requirements early on, was with the least amount of work. This was like, we both probably celebrated, had a beer or something, and said, let's do it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, when we talked about, we evaluated other systems. All systems were great, but some of those will require us to do a lot of refactoring of the components. Some of the markup, some of the
Hmm.
way Twig was written will require us to redo some of that. This we didn't have to do any Twig refactoring, any CSS or JavaScript or anything or YAML. It was all the same. We simply added that stories file, and you'll see how that Storybook consumes everything from the rest of the files to just render your component, your story, basically. which is really, really great. So that's all we have as far as our thinking process. What we went through to arrive where we are, and the rest we can show some code demos and talk about some of the things that we did and why. Maybe any questions will come up from there, and we can discuss those as they come.
Sounds good. All right.
Great.
Chaz, we've got your VS Code up here.
Yeah, so I'll explain the kind of the architecture briefly here in a second. But since we kind of transitioned from the card component, I just wanted to show you an example. So um, now, all naming conventions aside, you could really name things however you want, and name things are always hard. In fact, when we redid this, we did rename some of the things, but inside our source folder, we have a folder for our patterns, and so those break down into different things. But you can see inside of our patterns components folder is that card folder that Mario was talking about. And so it has a CSS file, it has a markdown file, in this case MDX, which is what Storybook uses. There's a Twig file, there's a YAML file, and then there's the stories file. So without going in deep, CSS is CSS. We are using some modern conventions with CSS variables. We are using PostCSS. Markdown is like any other type of markdown, with the exception of the MDX allows us to do some cool things with our documentation, like actually pull in the actual story and display it, which I'll show you in a second, inside the documentation, which you wouldn't normally be able to do with regular markdown. Our Twig is just that. It's basic Twig that you generally would find in a .html.twig file if you weren't using a component-based design. So instead, we've taken what would normally be in a Drupal .html.twig template, put it into a vanilla.twig template with the markup as is. And then the YAML file, if you're not familiar with this concept, YAML file is what I would consider the static data. Whereas when we tell Drupal to talk to us, Drupal will pass in its dynamic data that's coming from the content management system. And so these are just key value pairs. So when you print modifier, in this case, it'd be empty. If you printed the image key, it would have this image element, etc. And then those are consumed and printed out in the Twig files, as you can see here. And then those were already done. It's literally, with the exception of making a couple changes to this MDX file, everything came across as is from our Pattern Lab instance. And so if somebody out there is thinking, how do I get out of Pattern Lab, since Pattern Lab really isn't being maintained anymore, and how do I get into something new? It's just that simple. And this was really where it made sense for us to go to Storybook. Mm-hmm. So the only thing really that got added was this stories.jsx file, which also still takes the name of the Lego or component in this case. And so if I go take a look at this, we can see all it's doing is consuming things that are around it. And so the most important one was at the top here, where we have to parse the HTML into a React component for Storybook to display, but it imports the card from the Twig file. So it grabs this Twig file, and then it grabs the data from the YAML file. And then there's just some different things in here that are Storybook-esque. So like, for instance, the settings, this is how it actually will display, and I'll show it to you in a second. So it'll display in a sidebar menu under components as card. And then you can have variations of a card. So in this case, we're not having to repeat our Twig. In this case, we're not having to say, this is an event card, this is an article card. We just say, hey, here's the base component, it's a card. And in this case, we want to call it event card. And then we're just rendering out the arguments. We're passing this Twig file and our data to this. And so that's how Storybook is rendering this. And so if I flip over to my Chrome real quick, let me stop and restart this. Sorry. So I'm running a command here called run watch, which actually builds out the component itself. And then actually starts our Storybook instance. And so if we go and look under components, there's the card, which we saw in the folder structure. If I click on card, the first thing it'll show is the MDX file. And this is where it's really cool, because not only are you creating a living style guide of just visual display, but you can then start adding documentation, which is the bane of all
Mm-hmm.
developers, right? We don't like doing the documentation. So
Mm-hmm.
um, Storybook has something called auto docs, where it actually will generate a lot of the documentation for you, or you can go into more detail like
Mm-hmm.
we've got here. And this actually is printing out a copy of that event card. And you can see, and then also an example of the article card. And then if you actually go into the component itself, there's the visual rendering of it. And the key values you saw in the YAML file are actually displayed for you under controls as well. So like you can actually see there's the image, here's the title that's being used, here's the date, different things that here. And the nice thing about this, for instance, right here, this says the Drupal Association, but I can easily change this on the fly and say Pantheon, and it changes for my user. So
Mm-hmm.
think of your end clients. This is the important thing about having a living style guide. They can get in, they can play with things. They can say, okay, well, what if I add some really long text? How does this break my component? What does this
Is
look like? Yes, go ahead.
I see an update story button. Is that
Yes,
will that write back to the file system?
it will. We leave it on. We don't use it that often, but
Mm-hmm.
it will actually
Mm.
right back to your file. And this is something new in the latest version of Storybook that you can now start doing.
Yes. I did not know that. Ooh.
Yes,
That's exciting. Potentially dangerous, but also cool. Uh,
yes. Well,
you know,
since everything's in code and
yeah,
it's revisioned and such, we can easily revert back something if we accidentally
sure.
I didn't even notice
erase
that,
it.
to be honest with you.
Yeah, so that came out in the latest version of Storybook. I didn't notice it until the other day either, and I said, well, how does this work? So I'm going to say
Yeah.
update story, and it says updated
Mhm.
story event card. And if I now go look at I think it actually adds it to the Twig file. Oh no, in the stories file. Sorry. There you go.
There you go.
So it actually
So it should
adds it as
just
an
add.
argument to the story. So it won't mess up your Twig file, your YAML file. It's an actual
Mm,
story that's created. But yeah,
interesting.
I found that to be very interesting and as well as very powerful from a standpoint of being able to then kind of create things on the
Mm.
fly. And so
So,
now it's using the YAML file because I got rid of that argument. So
all right, we may be going too far down a rabbit hole, but that's part of the fun of these conversations. Does that mean we can use the Storybook interface? Like, so let's do a role playing exercise. Chaz, let's imagine I'm your customer. I'm like, oh, this event card looks great, but can I see it with like a super long title?
yeah,
Would
so
would you then have the option to like just in this browser-based interface add a second story using the same card that adds the super long title?
so
Or like
you can monitor.
nested stories, you mean, in this particular one? This particular one hasn't built that way, but we do have other ones
Mm,
where we have nested stories into
yeah.
into the yeah under collections. I don't know if you have the content highlight there.
I guess I think I'm more just hung up on the meaning of the word story here. Like, is the story like this is the story of
Yeah,
this
so
card in this
let
context?
me talk a little bit about that because this is kind of what I've been writing about the last couple months is the storybook and kind of the language that it uses. So, we're used to calling things components, right? And then we say, okay, we want a different version of that component. So maybe a horizontal version of the card. We will say that's a variation of the component. In Storybook, those variations are called stories. So, so in our case, we have the same card that is used for events and is used for articles, and they have slight differences between the two. So stories are in Storybook are those variations that we usually create from the
Ah,
original component.
yeah. So if you did have a demanding client who's just like, I want to see the super long
Right.
title, you can say, okay, fine, we'll add a story called
Exactly. We can do that.
card. hard with really long title,
Hmm.
and then it'll just be there in perpetuity,
Or
and we
change some of
won't.
the fields, or or the
Yeah,
layout of the
right.
component. Yeah.
Hmm.
For example, this article card is actually inheriting from the event card, and then it's
And
giving the name
yeah,
of our card,
okay.
changing argument. So, for instance, and this is the
Yeah.
cool thing about this. Let me put these kind of side by side real quick so you can kind of see, because it's crazy how fast it is. So I'm going to go and I'm going to duplicate this article card. I'm going to call this my Pantheon card and change the name here. And that's all I'm going to do. I don't know if House you just saw that real quick. All I did was
That was
hit
very
save
fast. That was
and
very fast.
my Pantheon card.
That was very fast.
Yes.
uh, when you stopped and restarted your, I think it was npm run watch, presumably wrapping Vite, I
Right.
also noted that started up really fast.
Yeah.
That started up a whole lot faster
In
Yeah.
fact,
than
the reason
my.
the reason why Chaz put them side by side is because otherwise you can't see. You're not quick
You won't
enough
even
to
notice,
jump to the
right?
Gone,
browser to see.
gone are
Yeah,
the days of hitting save, going to the browser, hitting refresh, or
refresh.
saving, waiting a couple seconds, seeing it actually refresh, and so
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
you had mentioned this earlier, way back when the first time that someone showed you hot module replacement,
Reload. Yeah.
and so
yeah,
if you look right here, that's HMR is hot module replacement. So Vite actually
yeah.
is looking to see what is the only thing that's changed, and that's why it's so fast
Hmm.
because it sees that little thing, and the minute you hit save, like me and
Hmm.
Mario can't see it fast enough. It's there by
Yeah.
the time we go to take a look at it, and that was one of the keys also of not going with Webpack and instead going with Vite because Vite was I didn't do some sort of analysis, but if I just had to throw a number out there, 1,000 times faster than Webpack,
Hmm.
just ridiculously fast. There were some
Don't quote us
caveats.
on that though.
Uh,
Don't quote us on that.
yeah,
What I'm seeing is sub-second reloading time, whereas if it's above a second, you're gonna notice it's going to introduce a little bit of friction.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
if it's below a sec, if it's around 100 milliseconds, the blink of an eye, then it feels instantaneous.
yeah.
Uh,
For instance,
what?
for it to compile when I first reran it, it
Hmm.
ran 253 milliseconds,
Hmm.
and the preview, the storybook instance of the browser opening up for the first time, loading it was 1.3 seconds, and then you saw after that it's sub seconds. It's
Yeah.
silly.
So we've seen a lot of what's happening in the front end development world. How does this make its way into a Drupal site?
Yep, good question. So we had started by saying, wanting to have a living style guide. And so, in order to really have a living style guide, you need to be able to tell Drupal, WordPress, Craft, Grav, anything that Symfony, anything that understands Twig can use this concept of includes and extends and embeds. And so, same concept here. So we were able to stick with Twig with Storybook using some different libraries and stuff. We were able to literally just go to our templates. In this case, we'll look at the content. So there's a node for article card, and this is following Drupal's naming convention of node dash dash the name of the content type and the name of the display mode dash twig. So if I actually go and click on this, you'll see that instead of this markup here living in here on the Drupal side, we said no, this is going to always live in Storybook, and Drupal, you will actually consume this. There's a lot of documentation because we like documentation, but if I get down to the nuts and bolts of it, you can see here saying, hey Drupal, when you render the article content type and its card display mode, we want you to actually include this components, which points to this folder here, card, which is this folder here, and then pull in the twig file. And in doing so, then pass dynamic values versus static values, which is what Storybook was using.
Mhm. That namespacing detail is it's such a nice improvement compared to absolute or relative
Yeah, for sure.
file directory structure, uh, which which is a world in which I'm working on some projects right now. I'm like, it doesn't have to be this way, but when is it worth when is it worth doing the upfront work to refactor to get that sort of
So, Steve,
a benefit? I'll,
earlier you
mhm,
asked about, how do you keep, right, the living style guide? How do you really ensure that
yeah,
the living style guide is the single source of truth? This
mhm,
template that Shaz showing here, this is a presenter template. Its only job is to pass data from Drupal to the component.
mhm,
As you notice up
yeah,
here, there's no markup whatsoever here because everything is
mhm,
coming from the style guide. And this is
mhm,
the way each of our components is actually rendered and integrated with Drupal.
mhm. So what I'm just noticing this in the last minute or two. Chaz, it looks like in your Explorer, what we have presumably get cloned here is a Drupal theme. That's your top level directory here?
Well, yes and no. Uh, literally, the only thing that's Drupal-esque in this repo that you're seeing is the fact that I have some .html.twig files that Drupal understands how to print, as well as I do have like a libraries and breakpoints. But I can easily take all of those out. And this is the other nice thing about using a living style guide and a storybook is if I don't, I mean, yes, we're mainly in the Drupal space, right? But that doesn't mean that I can't plug this out and drop it, like I said, to WordPress using the Timber plugin or Craft or Grab or Symphony or anything that understands Twig. I can pick this up and plug it into that. And that's the power of having this as a living style guide is Drupal 12 might become completely headless. Not saying it is. Drees don't do that. I wouldn't. I've recoupled more things that I've had to decouple. So,
You will lose
uh,
us.
but that's a perfect example of
That
like not having to reinvent the wheel as things mature. So,
Chaz, that is something that I may have to quote you on. I think you just said, "I've recoupled more things than I've decoupled."
yep.
And that's a good data point. But yes, I think it makes sense for the way you're working to have the theme directory be the layer at which you're working because, my correct me if I'm wrong, but part of my understanding of how this, integrates into the larger set of Drupal sites that you are working in service of for UCLA Health is like it is beneficial to those Drupal sites to think like we're just bringing in a Drupal theme. That Drupal theme happens to have Storybook in it, and it's doing lots of complex things. But for the individual Drupal sites for UCLA Health, they're just bringing in what happens to be a really well built Drupal theme. And for all of the Drupalisms, they don't the Drupalisms don't need to know uh, about the Storybook part.
Correct, and so that's that separation of responsibility,
Mhm.
and single responsibility. All the things that when we were first learning how to do like object oriented type of programming, keep it simple, dry, all that stuff that was really played into how we architected this in such a way that Storybook doesn't know it's sitting in Drupal. Drupal doesn't know inside using inside a Storybook until I tell, and
Yeah.
Mark uses a term there with that I think comes across really well that Drupal's templates are just a presenter. It's saying, hey, what do you want me to output? Well, in this case, I want you
Yeah.
to put what's in my Twig file that I happen to be using, just in this case, Storybook to present the front end outside of Drupal and using Drupal to present the Storybook stuff inside of Drupal. So, but it doesn't matter that those two know each other, exist, or care about the fact that they exist. It's just using straight up, Drupal 101, and I wouldn't even say that. I'd say Twig 101 concepts of using an include and a with pass things into something to actually be output.
Yeah, that seems like a really clean way of doing it.
If you want to continue, go ahead. But I was wondering if you can show some of the Vite configuration and automation that you. I don't know if we have time for that, Steve, or
Sure. Yeah. As someone who just dipped his toes into the Vite waters in the last 2 weeks, I absolutely would love to see a real life Vite config.
Definitely. And so there's two things we really, in order to get this to work, and it was very very simple. It was just a bunch of trying different examples, and one is obviously we have Storybook, which is kind of the library presenting our Twig components for us outside of a content management system, and then Vite, which was our tool set for JavaScript to be able to import different libraries, do some compiling, the hot, in this case, the hot module replacement that you're seeing running here. And so to do that, we needed to have some sort of configuration file. And this is a nice thing also, if you've come used to a Webpack world. Webpack world generally has multiple config files. Well, with Vite, there's only a single config file you need to worry about. And if you really wanted to kick it up a notch, you could actually move this Vite config actually inside of the Storybook file all by itself as well. I like to, again, separate responsibilities. So what does this Vite config file look like? It's very just JavaScript-esque in its nature. And so if you're comfortable with JavaScript, you'd be very comfortable in what I'm going to show you here. So the first thing was you have to import and define the config that Vite's going to use. And so you could have called this whatever you want. We decided to call it define config. And then we said, okay, well, Vite needs to understand what it is that we're working with. Okay, so there's a plugin for Twig Drupal, which was very nice. There is a plugin for YAML, and then the other things that we needed to do between Drupal's Twig and YAML was how do we handle our JavaScript compilation for our JavaScript files that we might have that we want to use for different types of interactions with our Twig file. How does it handle our CSS? It doesn't matter if you're using Sass, Less, Lightning, Tailwind, or PostCSS, or just vanilla CSS. We just needed something to say, hey, take these CSS files, and if we want to compile some things down so we can keep those separated, be able to do that as well. And then we also then wanted to kick it up a notch, and we have things like prettier, we have style linting, we have ES linting, which I'm not going to go too much into ES linting because that whole area is changing quite a bit. Then Mario is going to have a smirk when I say that. But outside of the imports, then it was just, okay, what am I telling Vite to do? Inside this define kit config, there's some plugins. So one of them was, and this is a nice thing about Vite, is I could have it run my linting for me simply by running npm commands. And so something I could run in command line, I can have Vite do as well. The other thing that we needed to do was be able to copy our what we call static assets, which is our images and our videos, as well as some JavaScript into particular destinations. So in this case, all of our source code is in our source folder, but when we compile it down, it ends up in our dist folder for our CSS, for our images, for our JavaScript. And then we just had to tell Twig and Vite so that when Storybook goes to use this, what those namespaces were. So if you're familiar with the components module in the Drupal ecosystem of how to have Drupal and Twig understand what regular Twig is, it's a same concept here. We said, hey, Twig, here's our namespaces, base maps to this, elements maps to this. And so that way, when it looked inside these source folders, when it was compiling stuff, it knew exactly components was pointing to, or at collections was pointing to. And then really the whole build process is this right here. It's very simple. It's ridiculously simple in its nature. We said, hey, when you build, empty the output directory, in this case, our dist directory. So it completely cleans it out and repopulates it on every single save and compile. There is, and what is that directory called? In this case, we called it dist, but you could have easily named it whatever you wanted to here. There's a roll-up option, and this roll-up option is using roll.js, and it's nice because you can do globbing, and it looks inside my patterns folder and says, oh, here's the CSS files. I'm going to glob anything that needs to be globbed, which is compiling multiple files together if it needs to, and then it's going to output it to my CSS folder with the name, so we individually end up with CSS files. In this case, for our card, for our date badge, for our date, other components and utilities in here are individually compiled into single files. And then finally, we have something where we will then take those and kind of group those into normal areas where we would, like our global CSS, our print CSS, our utilities. And this is really the nuts and bolts of Vite config. And it can get as complex or as simple as you want your config to be. And in this case, you're seeing we're doing very simple things that historically you would have done with grunt, you would have done with gulp, you would have done with webpack, but we're doing it in 63 lines of code, which is ridiculous. So
Uh, one detail that stands out to me, and just overall, I find this very very exciting to see what feel like pretty elegant solutions to what have been sticky problems. Um, One detail that stood out to me was, I think it was in the dist folder, there was still, separate CSS per, button
Yeah,
card. So am I correct to
correct.
assume that Drupal is still then aggregating the CSS? That, like, while Vite certainly could
Right.
take all these and make one big CSS file, you're leaving that job still to
I
Drupal.
think Drupal does a really good job with that. I always liked it the way Drupal does the that. I don't know. I can't remember when we started. We had minifying off on Storybook. I don't know if we turned it on or not, but that's correct. We want individual files because in Drupal we want to take advantage of Drupal libraries, right, to attach the style to the components so that we're only loading the styles that and JavaScript that we need. But yes, uh, CSS and JavaScript. What aggregation is on in our Drupal side, so Drupal is able to do more stuff. But Vite can also do it for you if you just turn on minifying on. It will minify that, and also we are aggregating, compiling or combining for storybook purposes. We are using one style sheet only. Well, two or three, I think. See that styles file that you see, the styles.css? What we've done here is we've combined all the CSS and the entire project into this one file just for storybook purposes. Because otherwise, we would have to be importing each style sheet into each of the stories in Storybook. That to me seemed manual work and no. So might as well we decided to say, why don't we just combine all the CSS into a style sheet and put that style sheet in Storybook's preview, so all the styles will automatically be available to all the stories within the Storybook interface.
yeah, and the reason we and there's two different approaches, right? And that's that lovely thing about Drupal. There's always two different ways to build, multiple ways to build stuff. But we've kind of followed that kind of smacks approach to that Drupal came out with Drupal a long time ago, and making sure that, like, for instance, the button stuff is in the button CSS file, and if this button CSS file relies on anything that's in our global or utilities, make sure that comes first. It makes it so that these are very independent of one another. We can literally take our card folder, which has everything in it, and drop that folder into another Storybook project, and it would work because it's already has all the components that it needs to inside of it. Not to keep using the word components, but you had brought up. I want to caveat off of that. So the only other thing we really haven't taken a look at is the Storybook folder itself. And so the story folder has to be at the root of your project. So that was one thing that we had to get used to. But inside there's really only two files that you really need to worry about yourself. One is this main.js, and the other is the preview, which is actually what the front end of Storybook runs off of. And so in here you can say, hey, for the config of Storybook in our main.js, our stories for Storybook purposes consist of these files. One is an MDX file, and the other is a .stories file. And it doesn't matter if you're using JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, if you're using module JavaScript, if you're using TypeScript, it'll know based off of this, like, what extension to be able to use.
Mm.
Add-on section is completely optional. This
Yeah.
gives you some of the different interactivity, like we saw that update story and create story and the reset in the interface. So this add-ons you can completely leave off if you wanted to. This is the big part here, which is a framework, and this is where when we first started, we first started with Storybook /HTML just to see what that did, and then Storybook /Vite by itself to see what that would do, and then we started looking at the documentation of Storybook and noticed that 100% React is supported. So there's actually a React-Vite framework that we decided and ended up on. So that way, if we wanted to create not Twig components, but actual React components straight in the story itself, we can do that. But we can also then rely on our Twig background. And then the static directory where it's looking for stuff is in this dist folder. And then the last really is this preview, and this is kind of really where the magic happens. We say, okay, import Twig from Twig.js, import Drupal filters. So since we're going to be writing our JavaScript, and I think we have an example of some JavaScript file I can show you, because we're using Drupal attributes. Well, Storybook doesn't know what Drupal attributes are, and so or what Drupal filters are, or the like. And so there is this Twig Drupal filters. We say, go ahead and pull this in, and then in order for Storybook to understand the actual things like once and Drupal settings and Drupal.js, we have this Drupal folder where we literally just, this is the only copy pasta, I guess. So it's happening. We said, let's go ahead and grab copies of those from core. And so when we update this, we'll look to see there's changes. Drop that it's in here, but import them in here so that it understands when Storybook renders what a Drupal attribute or Drupal behavior is. Here's what we're calling the compiled styles and the compiled Storybook CSS, so that it's available to all of us. And then literally the last piece of this is where we're setting up that Twig.js to say, hey, go ahead and turn off the caching, which is kind of counterintuitive. You think that would say false, but it doesn't. We want to use Twig Drupal with the Twig, and then we're just returning that Twig object so that when it goes and we say import on that card for Twig, it knows what it's trying to render. Anything else in here is just like decorators and some different effects, is just for extending our Drupal space inside of Storybook. Do we have one?
The content highlight. I don't know if you have that one there.
Sliders here. So for instance, slider.js. So, and we have ESLint disabled right now on purpose, because the ESLint configuration file has changed recently. So we're in the process of updating that. But you can see here, like Storybook can actually output Drupal as an object and understand what Drupal.behaviors are, and what, and using once and things like that because of what we're pulling in at the top here. And so, for instance, if I flip back over real quick to our collections here, and so if you're wanting naming conventions, how did this stuff get broken down real quick? So we're building on top of one another. So base is our CSS properties. So like aspect ratios, borders, our branding, our default system colors, our fonts. And so those are all inside of our what we call our base CSS. And then from there, we go into our elements, which are your most finite Lego, so to speak, of the component building blocks. So, for instance, like a button. And then from there, if something is going to contain two or more, then that's generally going to be a component. And then if something then is going to consist of one or more components, that's what we call a collection. Previously we used to call that composites. Again, naming stuff is hard, right? So for instance, here's an example of that slider. And so you can see the slider JS in here, works the way it's supposed to. And then there's some different interactions with things that we build into our Drupal objects.
Decorators are there, the two bottom ones.
Yeah. So for instance, here's an example of decorators. Hey, I want to display the same story, but with a different background color. So you can see, like, we were able to change the background colors with these decorators, but instead of having to add some additional CSS to and markup to every single story, I'll show those real quick. Those are actually up here in story under decorators. We're just saying, hey, when you call, in this case, Santa Barbara Sand, wrap the story with this markup. And that gives us the ability to
Interesting.
write a storybook to do some more elaborate things with it. And there's tools inside Storybook I'm not even going to go into because you can really kind of find this out on the web. But you see at the top here, there's accessibility tools built into it, which is awesome. And you can see here, for instance, if I go back over to card and I go to accessibility, you can see there's 0 violations. So right, another mind blowing thing. You're like, okay, well, I can actually test the accessibility on this before it actually gets to Drupal. I can fix the problems in the living style guide, and Drupal
Yeah.
then I will worry about it inheriting accessibility issues. So
Yeah. So we are just about at time here. I'm curious for people watching the video. There's so much good stuff here. That there's a lot of details in those 63-ish lines. This is the question I was about to ask you. Yes, excellent. It's a public GitHub repo. So
yeah,
for those who want, like myself, I am going to dig through some of these config files to look for details that I didn't catch live. Uh, UCLA HS Health Services, I
yeah,
presume slash
service,
service surface slash surface
yeah,
is the place to go on GitHub.
yeah,
Excellent.
and there's lovely documentation. This is the main reason I love Mario to death is because he will document everything, and if I don't, he will make sure he stays on me to document
He
something
said he
as
loves me
well.
to death because sometimes he wants to kill me.
So if you do
uh,
go to the repo, the documentation here is awesome. It shows you exactly useful commands, how things are kind of are built, what the design system is, the methodology, and the available components here. We really slimmed down the components that were in here just because we made it a public repo for people to use, but we gave you enough examples so hopefully you can build upon it if you want to use it.
Yeah, and I think last
well,
time
excellent.
we updated that repo a month ago, we've been extremely busy, as you can imagine, with the migration. So we'll probably be upgrading this soon again once we have many things that we can port back to this here. Things that we've discovered in the last month or two in Storybook specifically
Mhm.
that we will migrate here. But this is a working version of our environment, really.
Yep. So, for instance, there's
Okay.
actually a link there will take you over to medschool.ucla.edu, and so this is actually an example of those components using that living style guide. Here's the article card as an
There's that
example.
card. Yeah. That's great. We're at time here. So Chaz Chumley, Mario Hernandez, great to catch up with you online. I can't wait till we see each other again in person at a future Drupal event. Thanks so much,
Absolutely.
Thanks
guys.
for having us.
Thank you.